So joining us now is Nicole Aschoff, who's on the editorial board over at Jacobin, and also published a fantastic article that you guys should check out in the latest issue of Jacobin titled "The Biden Doctrine." Delves into, some of the alleged foreign policy differences between Biden and Trump, which we'll get into, and is also the author of Smartphone Society, Technology, Power, and Resistance in the New Gilded Age, and also The Profits of Capital. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we were just talking about the PRO Act and the fact that Joe Biden, as a candidate, ran on this idea that he's, pro-worker, pro-union, and wants to ensure that there's equality in this country. And of course, now that he's president, he has seemed to kind of like back off of mentioning unions or labor at all. Do you have any hope that he's going to in any way push for the passage of the PRO Act?
I would say I'm skeptical, certainly, particularly given his silence on the Amazon campaign, the campaign to unionize in Bessemer. I mean, if we think about the last, 30 years of the Democratic Party's relationship with organized labor, I don't think there's a lot of hope for a big change, and also just given Biden's own kind of track record. So no, not super hopeful, unfortunately.
Yeah.
What did you make about this airstrike in Syria?
Well, unfortunately, it seems to just reinforce a grim tradition of new presidents bombing within their first 100 days. So depressing, but unsurprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely find it unsurprising. Sorry, Nando, did you have a follow-up?
No, I mean, it's just been a kind of a double whammy week in foreign affairs, because there was the big news, obviously, about the airstrike in Syria, which we all just kind of throw up our hands and say, like, what are you going to do, really? And then there was this declassified intelligence report which explicitly tied Mohammed bin Salman to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which we all knew was true, but like it's just kind of now that it's on the record that the U.S. government actually believes that as well. And then Joe Biden, the Biden administration said that, like, we're really concerned about this, but we're not going to do anything. We're not going to do anything in terms of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. So, like, it made me think, what is the Biden doctrine? Like, is there a meaningful difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in foreign affairs? What are those differences?
Well, actually, I was reading in the FT that a Dutch newspaper referred to Biden as Trump with manners, which was, of course, caused a bit of an uproar. But I don't think it's far off. I think it's useful always, particularly, as leftists in the United States, to keep in mind the real difference between kind of domestic orientation toward policies at home and the U.S. as superintendent of global capitalism. And when we're thinking about the U.S. role as superintendent of global capitalism, continuity is really the watchword. So it's not just that, Biden is no different from Trump, but really we can think through many, decades of U.S. executive administrations and their policies toward, whether it's toward geopolitics, trade, the environment, continuity is really the watchword there. So I don't think, that's, I think, where we need to start from, because certainly over the past 4 years, there have been more than a few kind of hysterical assessments of how Trump would kind of rewrite the liberal international order. And I think with, him out the door and Biden in office now, we can kind of we should take stock of what Trump actually did and where we see Biden going. And I don't think we should overstate how much Trump really kind of undermined or reorganized a global order that benefits primarily giant corporations and the global elite.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, because I think that's an incredibly important point. And sometimes I see people make the mistake of believing Trump's rhetoric when behind the scenes he actually continued to expand on the foreign policy that we find objectionable, including increasing the use of drone strikes. He went into this trade war with China, and while there can be arguments made certainly regarding the negative impacts of free trade and all of that, what was interesting to me was it was a continuation of some of the hostility toward China that began under the Obama administration and his pivot to Asia. Now, of course, Trump is not some like sophisticated, careful person. He just kind of comes in. He's like a bull in a china shop. But if you really look at the focus, and some of the rhetoric that Trump used, it was just it was this fear mongering about the United States losing its hegemonic, position in the world as China is experiencing, its, I guess, increased influence in the globe. And so what do you think is likely to happen with the Biden administration? Because they both campaigned, Trump and Biden campaigned on some pretty they would make China the boogeyman in most of their political campaigns that ever touched on foreign policy. Do you think that Biden is going to continue with this antagonistic foreign policy toward China as well?
I think Biden is treading very carefully because, as much, we can certainly say that Trump did not kind of rewrite the global order, but by the same token, the global order, the global geopolitical order is not the same as it was 4 years ago. Particularly the relationship between the US and the EU and China and the EU. China is the largest exporter to nearly every country in the world, and the EU has only developed tighter ties and a tighter kind of dependence on access to Chinese markets and access to Chinese goods. So when we think about these kind of interdependencies, I don't think it will be so easy for Biden to just kind of reassert the role of the United States. He had that foreign affairs article where he talked about the need for the U.S. to get back at the head of the table, right, and kind of take on the mantle of leading the global international order. But things have changed in 4 years. That being said, the kind of tough on China rhetoric that has bipartisan appeal in the United States, and going back, of course, before Donald Trump, is something that I think we will see escalate, and for a few reasons. Initially there was this kind of fantasy that integrating China into the sort of WTO world order of global trade would change the country from the outside and make it more into a kind of a liberal capitalist country. Well, that project has failed. And instead, we see China succeeding on its own terms in developing not just broadly, its economic power, but also inserting itself into spheres that the U.S. sees as being in direct competition, such as high tech. So U.S. policymakers are very wary and uncertain about how to deal with China's economic ascent. So this is something that is worrisome, and I think the response of Biden, you talked about Obama's pivot to Asia, which was both military and, his attempts to craft the TPP to exclude China. I think that Biden will try to continue that kind of a two-pronged strategy, but how much support he receives from the European Union, for example, is unclear.
Yeah,
real quick. And when we talk militarily, we're talking about increased arms sales to other countries in the region. And by the way, that's certainly pushed by private contractors, military contractors, and weapons manufacturers in the United States. So there's like a profit model behind it as well. And so, yeah, that's what I think it's important to point out what that means militarily. It's just going to further destabilize that part of the world. And there is certainly a profit motive behind that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense, especially reading your article, the Biden the Doctrine in Jacobin, that on the one hand, while Trump maintained more or less the same kind of policies, I think that he did on some sort of superficial level, cause a lot of people around the world to not really trust the United States. I mean, I'm not talking about like liking the United States. I'm saying that before Trump, there was a certain sense that, you know, the U.S. was the empire, the U.S. was the hegemon, but there was kind of more or less this competent management of the flows of capital and trade, and you know, maybe we would go off on these little wars every once in a while, but like more or less the sort of liberal order was maintained, and that Trump kind of maybe scared people into thinking, oh, maybe the U.S. can't be trusted long term to maintain that. But on the other hand, the U.S. still has the 800 bases around the world, the 200,000 troops around the world. So it still has the actual hard power that is unparalleled and unrivaled in the world. And I get the sense that split is kind of a very dangerous one. that when China surpasses the United States in GDP at like a sort of symbolic moment, you know, that around the world will be like when China's the biggest economy in the world, not the United States, that the US with all the guns is not going to react very well to that. They're not going to take that kind of lying down, and that something kind of unstable might happen. I don't know. Do you get that sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's worrisome. I think it's useful to kind of step back and you know, situate kind of the success of Trump in scaring everyone, right, and why we saw that happening within the longer kind of crisis of neoliberalism and the kind of endless wars that the U.S. is waging, right, which are two different ways of thinking about it, but obviously they go together. So when Trump was elected in 2016, you know, that was also the year of Brexit, and it was also a year, you know, those kinds of couple of years there where we see a sort of surging right-wing critique of neoliberalism and what Trump called globalism. And people like Steve Bannon, right, which we don't hear about as much anymore, but this kind of right-wing critique of neoliberal globalization or neoliberal capitalism as being something that was hurting working people, hurting the sovereignty and power of the United States, that the liberal international order that had prevailed since, you know, in the post-World War II era was not benefiting America anymore, so we needed to get rid of that. And it was a sign of this kind of crisis of neoliberalism. Right. But at the same time, you know, in that context, we have a very steady kind of climate and landscape of endless wars perpetuated by the United States, particularly after September 11th, an ever increasing defense budget, and a very steady kind of global presence of U.S. military might. So I think the combination of these and how they'll play out over the next, you know, 4 years at least of Biden's administration, it's uncertain. In part, I think that the sort of crisis of neoliberalism and this idea that the sort of neoliberal world order would break down, particularly, you know, after the crisis of the coronavirus pandemic, I think we can say that that's not going to happen, and that global capitalism is really robust. But we also see with the bombing of Syria that the U.S. is not also willing to take a step away from playing global policeman. So the kinds of tensions that come from both of these, you know, two different ways of looking at the global world order are certainly distressing, particularly if the U.S. decides to deal with China by ramping up toward, you know, some type of more extreme kind of hot war situation in the South Pacific.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the role of the Federal Reserve and how that can impact, you know, the U.S. and its standing as a hegemonic power. Because while China certainly is experiencing this ascent, at the same time, when you think about the fact that the U.S. dollar has the power that it has, right? It's used in the global economy. During COVID, the global economy could have had a complete nosedive had it not been for the United States Federal Reserve essentially pumping money into the system under quantitative easing, something that I know you write about and talk about quite a bit. How does that play a role in you know, U.S. foreign relations, if any?
Well, this is a really interesting and kind of confusing situation for even mainstream economists, right? This sort of new normal of 0% interest rates and the willingness, particularly since the 2008 to 2010 financial crisis, by the major economic powers in the world to pump as much money as necessary into global stock markets and bond purchases and quantitative easing in general. We see a continuation of this policy, right? And a sort of endless willingness to prop up global capitalism. And so the question is, well, what are the limits of this, and why is the United States able to just perpetually, just print money and not worry about inflation or increased wages? And this is an interesting situation. It's not something that economists totally understand, right? What are the limits of QE forever? And it's not really clear how far it can go. I mean, Nando, earlier you were talking about the need for labor movements to actually create lasting social change. Well, we also need the power of labor movements to actually push for wage increases, right? The cost of capital and the cost of wages are historically low. There are very few constraints, and the political constraints that we should be seeing, right, sort of challenge to the U.S. dollar, we're not seeing that, and that's one of the ways that we can kind of measure the resiliency of neoliberal capitalism, right? There really isn't a challenger in terms of creating an alternative global kind of monetary order. So that's significant, certainly, when we're thinking about how robust global trade is. That's a big factor.
When I look at the situation, the political situation in the US, I look at the political situation in the EU, I look at the political situation in China and Russia, and it all just seems very bad. But there's kind of a slight glimmer of hope emerging from some of the smaller countries in South America. Bolivia just had the return of the MAS. In Ecuador, there's elections this spring that could signal a return of the left. It seems like Latin America might be kind of the front line of any sort of left resurgence in the world. How do you think the Biden administration is going to react to a sort of new pink tide, like a new generation of pink tide in Latin America?
Well, if Biden, it's hard to say. I mean, at this point, if Biden continues with the kind of Obama era, relationship to Latin America, we'll see kind of mixed signals, right? Certainly, we can recall the 2009 Honduran coup, which was very dodgy, but also the kind of increase in autonomy that Latin America experienced during the Obama years, right? So these kind of conflicting processes. I'm not really totally sure how Biden will, interact with potential opposition from Latin America. I think his primary goal at this point is to kind of solidify and restore the kind of Obama era global capitalist order and try to fit Latin American countries into that kind of framework, which is, not to the benefit of smaller Latin American countries. So it's also a question of how willing and able these kind of Latin American countries are able to carve out a kind of autonomous sphere in the global economy, which is much harder than it would appear to be, right? It's extremely difficult, and so that can sometimes overshadow the more overt kind of political relationships. Who's our ally? Who's our enemy?
I wanted to end on possibly some good news. In your piece, you're very fair in pointing out what Biden has done so far that isn't so awful. So, for instance, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. Does that give you hope that Biden will pursue a much more progressive climate policy, or are there still things that give you reservations?
Well, the Paris Accord is kind of a consensus, capital-friendly global agreement that's pretty much unoffensive to most of the major players. So it's good that Biden is willing to jump back into that. He's also made noises about, increasing and sort of building a Buy America program to deal with some of the catastrophic shortcomings of the kind of just-in-time global production system that we have, right? So if we can, make the U.S. less vulnerable to supply shortages in future crises, and also increase jobs, particularly in manufacturing in the United States. I mean, these are possibilities. And certainly, it'll be nice to not have someone that's incredibly embarrassing speaking for the United States at global summits. That's always a good thing. I don't think we can expect anything really different from Biden, but he may sort of grease the wheels toward long-term goals, right, of reducing emissions or, increasing manufacturing jobs at home. There's always a possibility for that.
All right. Nicole Aschoff, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you. And if you guys haven't read her piece in the latest issue of Jacobin, please do so. You should all be subscribed to it. And it's The Biden Doctrine. You can learn more about some of the topics we discussed on the interview today. Thank you again, Nicole.
Thanks for having me.